The next question is, how many rows and columns does your data have? So because we already printed this, and by default R showed us this handy sort of snippet of our data, we already know that it has 50 rows and 6 columns. It doesn't print there 50 rows and 6 columns, but that is what that was for. So in R, you will always, when R talks about the dimensions of your data or how many rows and columns it has, it will always print rows first and columns second. So that's why it doesn't print here 50 rows, 6 columns. It doesn't have to, because by default, always the rows will be first and the columns second. So that's what this means, 50 rows and 6 columns. If we didn't print out, if we didn't run this code that showed us this snippet of our data, there's another way which we could have used. So we could have used a function, we've seen it before, dim, and then followed by the round brackets. That's how we know that this is a function. And of course, because it's a function, it's going to perform an action, but we have to tell R on which object it must perform that action, and in this case it's on the object that we just created, demo data. So if I run this, again, just put your cursor anywhere on that line, control, enter, and then the result says 56. And so that looks the same as over here, 50 rows, 6 columns. So again, R doesn't print for you that the 50 is referring to rows or the 60 columns, because it by default will always print it like that, and so you will always know which ones are the rows and which ones are the column. I ask you, what do you think dim is short for? I already said the word a little while ago. So dim is for dimension. And so that's one of those things that I talked about in learning the language of statistics and the language of R. Dimension, the dimensions of the data is not necessarily a sentence that's going to come up over supper with your friends, but that's the way we speak in statistics. So dimensions means how many rows and how many columns does this object, this data object have. So that's what dim is short for, dimensions. Here I just repeat what I just said. The next thing we might want to know about our data, again, we know it already because we ran this, we just ran the name and we physically looked at the data. If we didn't want to do that, if we just wanted to know what the names of the columns are, then this function that just says names will give that to us. Again, it's a function, it's followed by the round brackets. Again, it has the object inside the brackets, the object of which we would like to know the names. So if you run that code, you're going to get an answer, and as you'll see, it corresponds to the names we already got when we looked at the whole object. But if we didn't look at it and we just ran this names function, then we would have gotten this answer. And again, so we would have seen, okay, the first column is named number, the next name ZA, age, and so on. Over here, I just explained that some more. You can read that as you continue through your own assignment. I'm just repeating that by default, when we print it as a table, it's going to show us only the first 10 rows. But if you absolutely want to see everything in the data, maybe you don't have a big data set like we do here, then you can call a specific function that's going to force R to show you all the data. And that function is print. So again, print followed by the round brackets, and inside the round brackets you can see here is the object name, but you can see there's more things going on here. So the previous function, there was just the function and one thing inside the brackets, and that one thing was the object. But now you can see there are more things. So what is going on here is we call these arguments. So the things that are inside the brackets of a function, we call them arguments. And most of the time, for functions, the first argument that you need to give is the object, like I said before, the object on which you want to perform the action or the function. So the first argument here is the object, but then this function needs more arguments. And arguments generally are separated by a comma. This is very important. If you leave out the comma, or if you put 2 commas, or you use a period instead of a comma, then the function is going to give you an error. So you separate it with a comma, then here's the next argument, n equals inf, comma, because there's yet another argument. The third argument is width equals inf. And so if you run this, you see what happens. So the printing part is obvious, because that's what the function says. So we expected that it's going to print the object for us. The n part was telling it how many rows it should print. So because we said n equals inf, what do you think inf is for? If we gave it this function, we said print this data set or this object, then we said n equals inf, and it printed all the rows. What do you think inf is for? We used it again when we said width. So in this case, width means how many columns should it be printing. So for us that wasn't a problem because we don't have a lot of columns, so by default it printed all of them. But if we had 100 columns, it wouldn't have printed all of them, it would have printed only these and just told us that there are more columns. So in this case again, it printed all the columns because we said width equals inf. So inf is for infinity in this case. So it just means print everything. Print everything that is there, so we just say infinity, so that however many there are, we don't have to know how many rows there are before it prints it, or before we can tell it what to print. We just say print an infinity of rows. So it stops. Obviously it does not print an infinity of rows, it stops when there aren't any more rows. And so over here we can see we actually have only 50 rows.